Hello and welcome to South2North, coming to you from Johannesburg, South Africa. Poverty, famine, darkness, corruption and tribal wars. These are thoughts associated with images of Africa in many Western media. Even though Africa is the fastest growing region in the world, a recent European survey found that people still see Africa as the hopeless continent. But what happens when Africans make images from their point of view? Can they reverse the negative stereotypes of Africa and Africans? And why is it so important to do so? I have with me two African photographers and an art curator and critic who are doing their bit to present a real and nuanced image of the African continent. All of them were recently involved in Artscape, a photographic series currently running on Al Jazeera. Nigerian-born Professor Okwui Enwezor, who is joining us from New York, is one of Africa's global voices. He's currently the director of the Haus der Kunst in Germany and numerous exhibitions at leading art institutions, including the Guggenheim in New York. In the studio, I have with me award-winning South African photojournalist Neo, and joining me later, Nigerian photographer George Osodi, whose book about the Niger Delta has won him accolades across the world. But before we start, let's take a look at this clip.
There's been frequent clashes among different ethnic groups. I realized that a lot of people have lost trust in their identity. I felt it was important that we should see this diverse culture as a point of unity instead of seeing it as something that should divide us as a nation. My responsibility is what I'm doing right now. I don't have anything to offer, but as a photographer who is keeping record and documenting this process and showcasing it to everyone who cares to see.
Professor Enwezor, thank you very much for joining us on South2North. We're delighted to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
In your book, Snap Judgments, you say that portrayals of Africa still amount to Afro-pessimism. What do you mean by that?
Well, Afro-pessimism basically represents the view that the only way to engage with Africa in terms of the media or in terms of representations of Africa is through the ideas of negation. The negativity of Africa is reflected through images that bear no relationship to the complexity of the everyday and the professional world that Africans occupy. And therefore, Afro-pessimism has come to become a stand-in for not only the very basic understanding of what Africa represents in the world and its place amongst other continents, but also as the way through which we get to know Africa better. And this has produced in its wake a range of distortions and a range of images that quite frankly, sort of needs to be contested or contextualized so that people who have no facility to properly apprehend Africa can understand in a critical way that it's a continent comprised of a range of cultural positions, a range of socio-political and cultural situations that cannot be molded into one simplistic outlook, the outlook of disease, of famine, or if you will, of endemic corruption.
How successful has this continent been in offering an alternative voice, a nuanced image of Africa? I'm thinking about the epic novel Heart of Darkness. So many years after it's been written, it was successful because it portrayed an image that was already active in the Western imagination of our continent. After so many years, post-colonialism, post-independence, how successful have we been in repainting Africa to the world?
The challenges that image makers face is really how to bring a questioning approach to thinking the continent visually to the rest of the world. So the success of doing that has to do with the participation of Africans across all levels of critical production, from being magazine editors to making decisions in terms of the things that you put in museums and in galleries and in exhibitions. So Africans have to play a role not just simply in terms of making images or offering alternative forms of visuality. Africans have to play a role in terms of also occupying the institutional infrastructure that can enable Africans to be able to offer a productive and engaged look on the continent.
In what way does your work, Professor, challenge those perceptions?
I begin my work by trying to to offer a context for the understanding of the mechanisms that drive artists, photographers, image makers, writers to make work. I begin from the point of view of the human context in which Africans are embedded. And by understanding that, I think one offers, if you will, a much more robust and complex view of the African imagination. So my work is to first ground what I do in a disciplinary setting before one moves it to, say, a socio-political context. Nevertheless, I would like to just simply say, though, that in my own work, I begin from the point of view that Africans have enormous resources of imaginative production to contribute to the rest of the world, not only to understand Africa, but to understand the rest of the world as such.
I'm curious to know, Professor, how is the world responding to those images? The media, in particular, international media, is often criticized as being only interested in stories of crime, of corruption, of lazy politicians who stay in power and don't know when to step down. Meanwhile, we've got art, we've got music, we've got literature. Is the world responding to what we have to offer?
Well, if you look at what has gone on in the field of literature in the last decade, it's very clear that the world is responding. The works of writers like Teju Cole, Chimamanda Adichie, and people like Chris Abani, and many other writers. It's very clear that there is an enormous, renaissance in thinking Africa in a very complex way. I think that the mistake that we make is when we become fixated only in the corrective idea about images of Africa. I think we need to be able to drive the agenda of what's important and not only to be responding to what we think has made Africa be seen in a light that is not, for want of a better word, pretty. So I think that the point is that we must drive the agenda, and we must also be self-critical when we do drive the agenda. It doesn't mean that by trying to show the positive face of Africa that we sweep everything else under the rug. I think that it's the place of artists and writers and thinkers and curators to look at the continent in a very critical light, but not in a one-dimensional way. So I would say that it doesn't do us any good to offer only positive images of Africa any more than it does the world any good if all we are able to see and engage with are those forms of negation that relegates the complexity of the African continent to just bare, pure media spectacle.
Well, let's hear from another guest born in South Africa during the apartheid regime. Ntsoma has fought to change perceptions of Africans, not only in the eyes of the world, but also amongst Africans themselves. Welcome, Neo.
Thank you, Lady, for having me.
I know that your photographs, your images have been published in international magazines like The Times, The Washington Post. What sort of images were they interested in?
They were interested in the images of poverty in South Africa, but photographed with respect.
Okay, and they wanted the chaos.
They wanted that. It was chaotic events, but not photographed in a hashful manner. Mm-hmm. And I think they just wanted something fresh, and I had something to give to the world. I'm going to photograph these people with respect. Mm-hmm. I'm going to photograph them like they really need help. They need to be treated better. Mm-hmm. So it was more like the dignity and the respect that came before anything else, when I photographed these events.
Have you seen a change in the demand for images of Africa? What is it that the world is looking for? What stories does it want to hear and read about Africa?
The world wants, they still are, stuck in the perception that Africa is all about poverty, all the things that you just mentioned now.
Corruption, the dark continent.
The dark continent. And
there is that. We mustn't deny it, as the professor has rightly said.
We have a lot of that, but also we shouldn't forget that we are a vibrant, colorful continent. And it's up to us as the local photographers to show that to the world. And once they say that, they respond well to it. The reason why my work ended up being published in all those magazines and newspapers abroad, and being given the platform to exhibit in overseas countries, it was based on the fact that for the first time they were seeing something positive, something fresh.
Would you say they were seeing reality? Because I grew up in a township, and sometimes it amuses me or frustrates me when people have certain perceptions of the township as this dangerous place where you can't go and educate your children. And a lot of professionals came from the township. People with resilience, with spirit, with soul, music, art, theater, it came from the township. So would you say what you are presenting is a real picture, not just the suffering and the negative, which is part of our reality, but also the alternative story? And how do we push those images onto the global stage?
That's the real picture right there. All the things that you just mentioned, you go anywhere in a South African township, there's this vibrancy. There's this young boy dancing at the corner of some street. There's this woman singing and being happy and forgetting about the poverty, and everything that is bad that the perception of the world about Africa has always been about.
I want to bring you in here, Professor Enwezor. How important is identity in informing the images that we portray about ourselves and even the stories that we tell about ourselves?
Well, identity is very important, but it cannot be seen only as a singular framework through which an artist or a writer or a curator operates. I certainly am very, very proud of my Nigerian origin. I'm very proud of my Igbo background because it enforced my worldview of how to be in the world and how to navigate the world. So identity is, in fact, very, very important. But the backdrop of identity also has to do with the way we live with others, the way we receive the world of others. And so we cannot really be very proud of who we are if that worldview does not inform the way we not only see ourselves, but also the way we project ourselves to the world.
Well, we have another guest joining us to talk about imagining Africa and how we are portraying this world. Part magician, part photographer. I think that's the best way to describe our next guest. George Osodi has the ability to entice people through his powerful image to witness environmental Armageddon in the oil fields of the Niger Delta. The pictures have earned him praise worldwide, and he joins us now.
How are you?
Thank you very much, George. Have a seat. Delta, Nigeria. This is the book that you put together, but you're also calling it The Rape of Paradise. Is that your reflection of what actually happened on the Delta, Nigeria?
I saw the Delta region as a beautiful place, a paradise that it still is. It's just that what is happening at the moment is more of an artificial thing, and it's still got that tendency to be the paradise that I think it is. I have an agenda, and it's simply more of wanting to keep record.
These are critical images, and they make powerful commentary. Is the space more open for this kind of output?
At this stage, we should be talking about wars in Africa. I think that era is gone. It's got to be more of an intellectual war.
There have been many Western photographers, writers who have made a name for themselves, taught at universities all over the world, and their work is based on their depiction, their interpretation of Africa. I think there's space for all of that, but what about Western scholars and academics who are writing, who are portraying Africa? Do they have a particular responsibility to portray Africa in a particular way?
I don't know if it's a responsibility of academics to help us see Africa in a better light, but I certainly do believe it's a responsibility of academics to help us shape an understanding of the complexity of the situation in Africa. Ultimately, though, what is very important to put forward, I am a strong advocate that Africans like George, like Neo, are successful simply because they are embedded in the context in which ideas are produced. So when you see George's work, when you see Neo's work, you cannot just simply dismiss that work. You have to face up to that work. And simply because the artists are alive, they are participating in the contextualization of their project, and therefore it forces the academic, it forces the critics, not only to just simply look at their images, but also to respond and to reflect on the thinking behind the production of those images. So I am very, very encouraged by the fact that there are a number of very significant voices such as George and Neo emerging from the continent.
Thank you, Professor Enwezor, for giving us your time and sharing your insights with us. Thanks indeed.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
You've made the transition from hardcore news to fashion. Show us some of the work that you've brought for us.
The reason why I really enjoy working with them is because they also advocating the same principle, the same things, the same agenda that I've been pushing all along, trying to represent Africans in a positive light to the world.
Let's have a look at that. And the title is actually Rediscovering
Africa.
Africa. Would you say this is another celebration of Africa? As much as it's depicting a very sad and painful and bloody chapter, you have gone out of your way to find stories of survival and tenacity.
To me, it's more of a book of hope. That's how I see it. It's because I believe in the new Africa and the new challenge. I believe in targeting the younger generation of Africans who are much more well exposed.
Do you think international photographers and storytellers still have a place on the continent, or should it be African stories told by Africans?
I don't agree with you in that.
It's a question. What do you think?
Fine. I think they do have its place. I mean, it's a free-for-all. It's a global world. It's just about looking at things from different perspectives.
You are also doing work with traditional Nigerian monarchs. You visited them. You're telling their story in pictures. Tell me about that.
I've done, quite a lot of different projects on photography, trying to look at the monarchy institution in the country, looking at it from a cultural perspective. Nigeria is a very big country, and it's got huge population as well as diverse culture, and it's very multi-ethnic. For the first time, I find myself settling down, doing portraits, more of environmental portraits of these different monarchs who actually existed even way back before the colonial, inculcation into the continent. They were rulers. They had their kingdoms. They were in control, and the people listened to them. So it was quite, to me, interesting to celebrate them and bring out these images to a much more foreground where people, Nigerians as well, who have lost contact with customs, begin to reflect and see.
Relive the history or recapture it in some way, because that's important. We mustn't lose it. And I think that is the power of photography for me, that you see the transitions that a people goes through. You see their highs and their lows, and you preserve it for posterity. But I want to talk about Al Jazeera's Artscape program. What did that mean for you?
My project, which is the generation of change, is still the very generation that I've always been photographing all along. So this time was just to revisit the very people that I started photographing early in my career, just to see how we have grown as people in the industry, how the changes in the country has affected us in the positive light, in the bad light. I just wanted to retrace, the steps and just to kind of capture all of that, the history basically is like recapturing history, something that I've walked through and relived. And I spend a lot of time with there's a new trend called the Scotanis. They show up with their clothes and they just live up their lives crazy and
materialistic
youth, and really they don't have the same drive that we had. And now going back and now seeing all those kids, living the way they live, like, what's the purpose in that? But then it boiled down to one thing, like, I think they don't have the same drive. They don't have anything that they strive into. They're not running away from anything, or they're not trying to.
They're living in a free country.
They're living in a free country.
So they don't feel that unless I push hard, I'm not going to make it. Or the sense of urgency that stems from knowing that doors are closed because of the color of your skin.
The color of your skin. There were no restrictions.
And for you, George, the artscape, what does that mean?
Well, to me, it was more of a platform to actually showcase Africa from my perspective. There's a lot of heritage and customs that are found in many of these kingdoms. For this project, I really wanted to portray this. People travel from various places around the Delta region to pay homage to the river and also worship the god that is the shrine here. It has always been my dream to talk about Africa as a continent. I am so much in love with Africa. I don't think there's any other place to be except Africa. Again, the world is global. And, it's more of a challenge of trying to represent our image to the global landscape, trying to, again, I don't want to do images to please the Western audience, but it's more of telling the world, this is Africa, this is who we are. And, it's a very special continent, and things are done specially here. And it's easier for us as Africans to tell our stories because we know where we feel the pulse, we know where it hurts.
Do you think Africans have a particular responsibility? I asked the professor that question earlier. Should there be a mission attached to our work, whether you are a journalist or a photographer or a writer?
Yes.
Where's the fun in all of it, or is there place for fun?
I think as Africans, we have a great responsibility to portray Africa in the best light possible, not deducing the fact that there are issues behind. As image makers, we don't have to play down on that fact that we have problems here and there. But at the same time, we have also triumphed over the years. We have a new generation of Africans who have done great things, against all odds, and they deserve to be celebrated. In most cases, someone who comes in from the outside world may not really get to feel, grasp or feel the vibe, but then because you're an insider, and it's easier for you to understand your fellow African when it relates, it tells a story. You know when someone is lying.
I don't.
Yes, as an African, if your colleague, if someone is lying to you as an African, you know. But as a stranger,
you
can be sold.
Exactly, I was about to actually get to that.
I have to think about that, but I'm not sure about that.
It's happened to me a lot while photographing, while working on projects in Africa. You go to places, you know when they're telling the truth and when they're lying. But because it is now left to you to represent it in the manner at which you're trying to portray the true representation of.
Well, George, you spoke earlier about a new generation of Africans. You also spoke about that, a new generation of Africans that have a history, that have hope, that have optimism, and that have something to give to the world. So I think the two of you belong to that generation of Africa, and we look forward to many more stories in the form of images, photography, that will come out of your lenses. Thanks indeed for joining us on South to North.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Reggie.
Well, thank you for joining me on South to North. Remember, you can tweet your questions, comments, and opinions to @AJ South to North or find us on Facebook. Thank you for watching. See you next week. Bye-bye.